The orphanage stood on the edge of a sleepy town, its silhouette a shadow against the dying light of the setting sun. Its high, arched windows stared out like hollow eyes, as if the building itself had forgotten how to see. For years, it had been a place of refuge for countless children, a supposed sanctuary, a place where the abandoned could find a semblance of home. But that was before it closed its doors, before it became the subject of whispered rumors and unsolved mysteries. Today all that remains is a decaying structure, a place that feels more like a tomb than a building. No one dares to visit anymore. Those who do speak of an unease that hangs in the air, as if the walls themselves are alive with secrets they're desperate to keep hidden. In the final days before its closure, something was happening inside. Something the public never knew, something that was deliberately erased from the pages of history. The orphanage, once a warm haven for children who had lost everything, had begun to harbor whispers. Whispers that spoke of things unspoken, of strange occurrences, of children who stopped speaking or spoke in riddles. Of the caretakers who grew colder and more distant with each passing day. Those who had been there until the end would later describe it as a place that changed them, a place that left scars, whether seen or unseen. But what happened there, in the shadows of its walls, is a mystery that has yet to be solved. The authorities, after years of public pressure, finally made the decision to investigate. The orphanage had been closed abruptly, its doors locked and sealed, its records buried deep in bureaucratic vaults. The public never learned why, and the children who had once called it home were scattered, their stories lost to time. But rumors of strange happenings were persistent, and for those brave enough to look beyond the surface, the signs were there. The building itself seemed to breathe, exhaling the heavy weight of its past through cracks in its brickwork. The air inside felt thick, laden with the history of what had been. The first investigation was met with resistance. The records were sealed, the caretakers were silent, and no one seemed willing to provide answers. The authorities had hoped to uncover the truth quickly, to explain why a place that once served as a refuge had been abandoned in such a manner. But the deeper they dug, the more they found themselves lost in a labyrinth of silence and lies. And the more they uncovered, the darker the path became. They began to suspect that the answers they sought were buried far deeper than anyone had imagined, hidden in the very fabric of the orphanage itself. Rumors swirled about the orphanage's history, with some residents of the town recounting strange stories of their own experiences with the building. Long before it closed, it had earned a reputation for being a place where odd things happened. People spoke of strange noises at night, faint eerie sounds that seemed to echo through the walls. There were stories of children who wandered off and never came back. Those who had spent their childhood within those walls had a look in their eyes, a distant, haunted gaze that spoke of something unseen. Some said they were just children, their minds fragile and easily swayed by fear. But others were not so sure. The older residents whispered about how the orphanage had always been different, how something about it felt off. The building itself had grown into something of a myth. It was said to have been built by a wealthy benefactor, a man with a vision of providing the children of the town a better life. But something about the foundation of the place seemed to carry a weight that went beyond mere brick and mortar. Over the years, stories began to surface about its origins, and some of them didn't match up with what the town had been told. No one really knew who had designed it, nor why it had been built with such strange, almost cryptic architecture. The walls were thicker than they needed to be, the windows were too high, the doors too heavy. There were strange markings on the stonework, symbols that no one could identify, but they were always there, hidden just out of view. It wasn't until the authorities began their investigation that they started to notice these strange details. And as they ventured further into the building, it became clear that there were parts of the orphanage that had been hidden from view for years, rooms that had never been used, corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, and an entire wing of the building that had been boarded up and sealed off with no explanation. The authorities could only speculate as to what had been kept out of sight for so long. Perhaps there were records in these rooms that would finally explain what had happened, what had led to the orphanage's sudden closure. Or perhaps, as the rumors suggested, there were other, darker things buried within those walls, things too terrible to be exposed. The most chilling of all was the final room, the one no one had ever dared to enter. Locked behind a heavy iron door, it was a place that had been abandoned by all, even the caretakers. It was as if everyone who had ever stepped foot in the orphanage knew that it was a space best left untouched. The few who had come close spoke of a deep, oppressive feeling that clung to the air, a sense of wrongness that made even the bravest hesitate. No one could explain it. No one knew what lay behind that door, but everyone seemed to know that whatever it was better left undiscovered. As the investigation grew more intense, the authorities pressed harder for access to this final room. The records were still sealed, and the people who had worked there were either unwilling or unable to speak. Yet there was something in the air now, a sense that they were on the cusp of something momentous. The closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more it felt like the building itself was fighting back. The final room had become a symbol, a barrier that had kept the truth locked away for years. The more they uncovered about the orphanage, the more it seemed that the answers to the mystery were just out of reach. Every new lead seemed to take them deeper into darkness, and every discovery only raised more questions. What had happened to the children who had been abandoned there? What had really occurred in the final days before the orphanage's closure? And most haunting of all, why had the building been shut down so abruptly? Was there something in that final room, something so terrible that it had been buried forever? Or was the truth simply too much to bear? As the investigation drew on, the answers became more elusive, but one thing was certain. The orphanage held a secret, a dark secret that was just waiting to be revealed. The history of the orphanage stretched back decades, its origins clouded in a mixture of pride and secrecy. Founded at a time when the town was beginning to grow, the orphanage was a beacon of hope for children who had nowhere else to go. The town's founders had ambitious plans for the place, an institution that would care for the orphaned, the abandoned, and the forgotten. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where those without families could find refuge, warmth, and structure. But from the very beginning, something about the place felt off. The town, for all its progress, could never quite shake the strange atmosphere that surrounded the orphanage. Its grand stone walls seemed to loom over the rest of the town, as if it existed on a different plane altogether, both an anchor and an enigma. The orphanage's early years were marked by an air of respectability. For a time, it was seen as a noble endeavor, a place where children who had lost everything could find solace. The staff were devoted, the caretakers warm-hearted, and the children appeared to thrive under their guidance. At least, that was the narrative presented to the townspeople. In reality, though, cracks began to form beneath the surface, subtle at first but undeniable once the years had passed. The building, for all its stateliness, was already beginning to show signs of wear. The windows, though grand, allowed little light into the darker corners of the building. The corridors, though carefully designed, felt endless, as if they stretched on forever without ever leading anywhere truly significant. As the years passed, small things began to change. The children who came to live there were different. Some more withdrawn, others strangely silent, and a few, in whispers, were said to be afflicted by unexplainable fears. In the quiet of the night, some of them would speak in their sleep, recounting strange, unplaceable things. They would speak of a room they had never seen, or of figures who moved through the building when no one else was around. Some of the older residents of the town who had passed by the orphanage in their youth would recall a look in the children's eyes that unsettled them. It wasn't just sadness or loneliness, it was something more. A kind of dread, a fear that wasn't easily understood. And with it, the strange sense that whatever had happened in that place, it had left a mark that would not fade. The caretakers too began to change. Initially, they were viewed as pillars of the community, kind-hearted people who took in children with open arms. But as the years wore on, many of the staff became more withdrawn, almost robotic in their movements, their interactions with the children becoming colder. They would avoid eye contact, speak in terse sentences, and show little emotion. Whispers about their behavior began to circulate. Some said they had grown weary of the children. Others that they had become jaded after witnessing too many heartbreaks. But the most unsettling rumor of all was that some of the staff had begun to act strange. There were stories of them disappearing for days at a time, or acting in ways that defied explanation. There was one particular caretaker, an older woman who had worked at the orphanage for decades, whose behavior became the subject of speculation. Children who had been under her care claimed that she would stand in the corners of rooms, her back turned to them, murmuring in a language no one recognized. Some children swore that they had seen her walking the halls at night, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, her shadow stretching unnaturally long. And yet, the most unsettling rumors began to swirl around the building itself. The orphanage, once a symbol of charity and community, became a place shrouded in mystery. Those who lived in the town, especially those who had never stepped inside, spoke in hushed tones about the building's growing sense of foreboding. It wasn't just the physical state of the orphanage that seemed to decay, it was the aura surrounding it. The closer one came to the building, the more oppressive the air became, thick with an unshakable sense of unease. People began to avoid the orphanage, taking a wider path whenever they had to pass by. Even the children who had once called it home seemed to carry something heavy with them, a lingering sadness that couldn't be easily explained. As time went on, whispers began to spread about strange occurrences inside the orphanage. The first signs were small, odd noises, things going missing, and unexplained feelings of discomfort that seemed to seep into every corner of the building. But soon these oddities escalated. Children started to speak of things they could not understand. One child, a young boy named Thomas, became fixated on a room that was never mentioned by any of the staff. He would speak about it at length, describing in chilling detail the feeling of dread that would wash over him whenever he approached it. He was one of the youngest children at the orphanage, and his fear seemed irrational, but it was so palpable that even the adults began to take notice. Yet, no one could say why he had developed such a strong aversion to that particular part of the building. The door to the room, like so many others, was locked, but no one seemed to know why. It wasn't a room that was in regular use, nor was it one that anyone had ever spoken of, yet it lingered in the background of the orphanage like an unsolved puzzle. As the years passed, the orphanage's reputation began to shift. Where once it had been viewed as a noble institution, it was now regarded by some as a place of strange happenings, a place where dark forces were at play. The children's behavior grew more erratic. They began to speak of things that they couldn't possibly know, stories of things that had happened before their time, of things that could only be described as supernatural. The stories began to spread beyond the walls of the orphanage, reaching the ears of the town's residents. But those who tried to probe deeper were met with resistance. The orphanage's leadership, which had once been open and transparent, became more secretive. The records were locked away. The staff, once eager to share their experiences, now refused to speak. It was as though everyone was in on a secret, and the more the town pushed for answers, the more they were met with silence. Some believed that the orphanage's downfall had begun with the unexplained events that plagued its later years. No one could explain the strange occurrences that seemed to follow the children, the sudden disappearances, the whispers in the dark. The town tried to forget, to move on, but the unanswered questions lingered, like an unshakable ghost. The building, though now silent and abandoned, still holds the echoes of its troubled past. As the years went on, the orphanage became nothing more than a legend, a place spoken of in hushed tones, its history forgotten, its true nature sealed behind closed doors. But deep within its walls, the truth still waits to be uncovered, hidden from the world as the darkness continues to grow. The last volunteer at the orphanage, a woman named Clara, had always been drawn to the idea of caring for those who had been abandoned by the world. In her early 20s, she had arrived at the orphanage full of hope, eager to make a difference in the lives of the children who called the place home. The orphanage had, for many years, been seen as a place of warmth and security, a safe harbor for children who had been through unimaginable loss. But by the time Clara arrived, things had already begun to shift. The building, though still grand, carried an undeniable weight, an air of melancholy that seemed to seep into everything. There was an unspoken tension that hung in the hallways, and a strange quiet that settled over the children. It was as if the very walls themselves were keeping secrets, secrets that Clara could feel but never fully understand. At first, Clara tried to ignore the unsettling atmosphere. She focused on her work, on caring for the children, on making the orphanage feel as much like a home as it could. She spent her days playing with the children, reading stories, and trying to create a sense of normalcy in a place that, over time, had become anything but. But as the days wore on, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a coldness to the place that went beyond the physical decay. She began to notice the odd behaviors of the children, the way some of them would suddenly become withdrawn, as if they were retreating into themselves. There were whispers among the children, too, soft, eerie whispers about things they shouldn't have known, about rooms they weren't supposed to enter. The more Clara listened, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, though she still couldn't quite understand the full picture. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Clara stayed behind to tidy up the common area. As she moved about the room, a soft sound reached her ears, faint at first, like the fluttering of paper. But when she turned around, there was nothing there. She chalked it up to exhaustion, a trick of the mind, but the unease lingered. It wasn't long before she began to notice more of these strange occurrences. Doors that she was sure she had closed were left ajar. Objects that she had carefully placed on a shelf would appear shifted, as though someone had touched them without her knowledge. Sometimes the children would speak in their sleep, murmuring things that sent a chill down Clara's spine. One child, a little girl named Sarah, would often wake in the middle of the night, crying for no apparent reason, her small hands trembling as if she had seen something terrible. It wasn't just the children's behavior that disturbed Clara, it was the staff as well. The older caretakers, who had been there longer than she had, seemed to grow more distant as time went on. They no longer seemed to care about the children's well-being in the way they once had. They moved through the orphanage like shadows, barely speaking, rarely making eye contact. They would disappear for long stretches of time, only to return with no explanation. Clara tried to reach out to them to ask about the strange occurrences, but they would dismiss her concerns with vague, hurried answers. "The children are just tired," they would say. "It's nothing, just the weather or the building settling." But Clara wasn't convinced. Something more was happening, something that no one was willing to talk about. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's sense of unease grew stronger. She began to notice more unusual things, like the way the building itself seemed to resist her efforts to understand it. The orphanage, with its endless hallways and locked rooms, seemed to have a life of its own, a hidden agenda that she couldn't fathom. She had explored most of the building, but there were parts that were off-limits, rooms that were never mentioned, halls that were always locked. One night, while searching for a missing book in the storage room, Clara stumbled upon something she hadn't expected. Behind a stack of old boxes, she found a door that led to a small, dimly lit hallway. The door, though heavy and old, was not locked. She hesitated for a moment, a strange sense of foreboding creeping over her, but her curiosity pushed her forward. The hallway was narrow and dark, and the air was thick with dust. The walls seemed to close in around her as she made her way down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway, Clara found another door, this one even older than the others, with a tarnished brass handle that seemed to resist her touch. She had heard the whispers among the children, the stories about a room that no one was supposed to enter. This, she realized, was the room they had spoken of, the one that had been locked for years, the one no one dared to approach. Clara's heart raced as she stood before the door, her hand resting on the handle. She could feel the weight of something heavy behind it, something that had been kept hidden for far too long. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. What Clara saw inside that room would haunt her for the rest of her life. The room was small, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor creaking underfoot. But it wasn't the state of the room that disturbed her, it was what lay within it. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing. There were old, discarded objects scattered about the room, books, furniture, and other items that had been left behind. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, was a small wooden box. It was old, its edges worn with time, and it was covered in strange symbols. Clara reached out to touch it, her fingers trembling, and as soon as she did, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. The box seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if something inside it was trying to break free. Clara quickly pulled her hand away, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around the room, searching for any explanation, but there was none to be found. The room was silent, and yet, it felt as though it were alive, as though something in that room was watching her. She could hear her breath in her ears, feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But before she could gather her thoughts, the door behind her slammed shut. Clara spun around, her pulse racing, but when she reached for the door, it was locked. She was trapped. For what felt like an eternity, Clara stood in that room, her mind racing, her body frozen with fear. She didn't know what she had stumbled upon, but she knew that it was something terrible, something that the orphanage had been hiding for years. She could hear the whispers again, this time louder, more insistent, coming from all directions. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The room grew still, the whispers fading into silence. Clara stood there, breathless, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just experienced. She didn't know what the box had meant or why it had been hidden away, but she knew one thing: she was no longer safe. The orphanage had been hiding something, and she had just uncovered a piece of it. Clara never spoke of what she found in that room. The authorities never learned of the box, nor did they ever fully understand the true nature of the orphanage's secrets. But Clara left the orphanage shortly after that night, never to return. Whatever she had discovered in that room had changed her in ways she couldn't explain, and she carried the weight of that discovery with her for the rest of her life. The orphanage's dark history remained sealed within its walls, hidden from the world, as the whispers continued to echo through the empty halls. When the authorities began to investigate the orphanage, they did so with the expectation that the truth would come quickly. The building had stood abandoned for so long that it seemed impossible for any lingering mysteries to remain. Surely, the documents, the records, the staff accounts, all would be easily accessible. The closure of the orphanage had been sudden and unexplained, but surely, there was a simple explanation. Maybe it was a matter of poor management, a lack of funding, or perhaps a small scandal involving one of the caretakers. Nothing too grand, they thought. But as the investigation unfolded, It became clear that what they had assumed to be a straightforward case was anything but. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves immersed in a web of secrecy, locked doors, and missing pieces of the puzzle. The first stumbling block came when the authorities sought to access the records of the orphanage. They had hoped that the documents would provide a clear picture of what had happened in the months leading up to its closure. There had to be some paper trail, notes, files, incident reports, that could offer them a window into the events that transpired. But when they requested access, they were met with resistance. The records, they were told, were sealed. Officially, it was for reasons of confidentiality, protecting the privacy of the children and the staff. But this only raised more questions. Why had the records been sealed so tightly? What was there to hide? At first, the authorities accepted the explanation, assuming it was just bureaucracy at work. But as they pressed for more information, they discovered that the seal on the records had been in place for decades, and no one, no current or former staff member, seemed willing to discuss the matter. It was as if a veil of silence had descended over the orphanage's past. The caretakers who had been involved with the institution refused to cooperate, offering only vague answers when questioned about the building's final days. They would speak in generalities, offering no specifics. If asked about certain events, they would simply change the subject, or worse, act as though they hadn't heard the question. The air of secrecy surrounding the orphanage was palpable, as if everyone involved was bound by some unspoken pact to keep the truth buried. But the more they dug, the more the authorities began to suspect that there was more to this silence than mere confidentiality. The search for answers led them to the staff, the people who had worked at the orphanage during its final years. But these individuals proved just as elusive. Some of them had left the town shortly after the orphanage's closure, their whereabouts now unknown. Others had moved on to different jobs, but when approached, they seemed uncomfortable discussing their time at the orphanage. One former caretaker, when asked about the events that had led to the orphanage's closure, simply stared blankly at the investigator before muttering, "I don't remember much. It was all too strange. Best to leave it in the past." It was clear that these people were hiding something, but no one seemed willing to speak. The authorities were left with a growing sense of frustration. They were no closer to understanding the truth, and it seemed as though the building itself was holding the answers just beyond reach. The deeper the authorities went, the more it became apparent that this was not a simple case of administrative negligence or financial trouble. The orphanage's history, it seemed, was deeply intertwined with something darker, something far more sinister. They had been led to believe that the closure of the orphanage was a matter of logistics, but as they started to uncover more hidden details, they began to realize that something far more nefarious had been at play. There were rumors of strange occurrences, things that the children had witnessed and things that the staff had kept quiet. But when those rumors were brought up, they were dismissed as nothing more than tall tales. The records, the testimonies, and the documents that could have illuminated the orphanage's past were locked away, hidden from view, as if the truth itself were a dangerous thing to expose. As the investigation pressed on, it became increasingly clear that there were key pieces of the story that had been intentionally erased. Several of the orphanage's buildings, including the one most central to the mystery, had been mysteriously sealed off in the final years of its operation. When the authorities attempted to gain access to these areas, they were met with resistance at every turn. The rooms were locked, the windows covered, the halls barricaded. It was as though the building itself was resisting their intrusion, unwilling to let anyone uncover what had happened within its walls. But the authorities weren't ready to give up just yet. They began to search for alternative ways into the building, contacting former employees, local contractors, and even old town officials who might have insight into the building's past. But every lead led to dead ends. It was as if everyone had been complicit in some elaborate cover-up, and the truth had been deliberately buried so deep that no one could reach it. The more they uncovered, the more questions they had. Why were these rooms sealed off so tightly? Why were certain records withheld? What could be so dangerous that it warranted such secrecy? The authorities tried to remain patient, to keep searching, but with each passing day the mystery deepened. The sealed records were just the beginning. They had hoped that these documents would provide clarity, but instead, they were met with silence. Each piece of the puzzle only seemed to raise more questions. What had really happened in the final months of the orphanage's operation? Why had it been shut down so abruptly? In the face of these unanswered questions, the authorities decided to take a more hands-on approach. They began to search the orphanage itself, hoping to find something, anything, that might shed light on the building's secret past. With each room they entered, they encountered new mysteries. There were hidden passageways, strange markings on the walls, and rooms that seemed to have no logical purpose. But the most disturbing discovery came when they entered the building's lower levels. Deep in the bowels of the orphanage, they found an area that had been completely forgotten. This part of the building was older than the rest, built at a time when the orphanage had expanded to accommodate more children. Here, in the forgotten parts of the orphanage, the authorities uncovered evidence that the building had been used for purposes other than caring for children. Hidden rooms locked away for years revealed dark secrets. These hidden spaces, which no one had spoken of in years, contained traces of something far more sinister. The walls were covered in strange symbols, their meaning unknown. There were old, tattered journals that spoke of rituals, of things that were buried beneath the surface of the orphanage's existence. As the authorities pieced these elements together, they realized that the building had been involved in something dark, something that had been hidden away for decades. The sealed records, the locked rooms, and the strange symbols all pointed to the same conclusion. The orphanage had been part of something far beyond the ordinary, something that its caretakers had desperately tried to conceal. The investigation now shifted into new territory. The authorities were no longer just seeking answers. They were uncovering pieces of a much larger mystery, one that had been buried under layers of silence and deception. The truth was out there, but it was clear that it would not be easily uncovered. The more they searched, the more the orphanage revealed its dark history, and the more they realized that the answers they sought were not only hidden in the building, but in the very people who had been involved with it. The discovery of the hidden room was just the beginning. What the authorities had initially assumed to be an abandoned structure with a simple past had become a labyrinth of secrets. The room, long sealed off, wasn't just another forgotten storage space. It was a place that had been deliberately kept hidden, its very existence shrouded in mystery. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the orphanage was not simply a charitable institution. It had once been the site of something far darker, a twisted undercurrent running beneath its surface. And as the authorities continued to explore its forgotten corners, they began to uncover the depth of what had been concealed. The room itself, though ordinary at first glance, carried an energy that was hard to ignore. It was smaller than many of the other rooms, its walls covered in layers of dust and peeling wallpaper, as though it had been untouched for years. But when they opened the door, the air inside seemed to hum with a strange tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. There were no windows here, no natural light to break the stillness. Only a single dim light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, unsettling shadows across the space. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a storage room, filled with old furniture, forgotten books, and boxes of discarded belongings. But as the investigators began to sift through the piles of debris, they started to notice something strange, something out of place. Hidden beneath a pile of old blankets and crates was an object that immediately drew their attention. A large wooden chest, its surface carved with strange, intricate symbols. The symbols seemed to pulse with a dark energy, almost as if they were alive, shifting slightly when looked at from different angles. The chest, though weathered and old, was still intact and it was locked. The authorities had assumed at first that this chest might simply contain old belongings, forgotten memories from a bygone era. But there was something about it, something that sent a chill through the investigators. The lock on the chest was not like any they had seen before. It was made of strange metal, black and unpolished, with symbols engraved on it that matched those on the chest itself. Curiosity drove them to open it, and when they finally succeeded, what they found inside was far worse than they had anticipated. The chest was filled with old papers, bound in leather, their edges yellowed and fragile with age. But the documents were not merely old records or forgotten notes. They were journals. Dozens of them, stacked on top of each other, their pages filled with writing that was hard to decipher. The handwriting was erratic, almost manic, and many of the words were scrawled in a language that no one in the room recognized. The entries spoke of strange rituals, of practices that defied logic, and of individuals who had come and gone, each leaving behind their own mark on the orphanage. The deeper they read, the more unsettling the discoveries became. One of the journals, dated several years before the orphanage's closure, stood out. It was written by someone who had worked at the orphanage for decades, a person who had known the building better than anyone. The entries described how, over time, the orphanage had shifted from a place of care to something else entirely. The tone of the writing was that of a person unraveling, descending into madness as they became increasingly consumed by the building's secrets. They spoke of strange gatherings held in the dead of night, when the children were supposed to be asleep. Of figures, cloaked in shadow, who would come to the orphanage and disappear before dawn. The journal entries became more and more incoherent, filled with cryptic references to things that made no sense. References to ancient rites, to forgotten gods, and to a power that seemed to inhabit the orphanage itself. It was as though the building had become a vessel for something far older, something that had been waiting to be awoken. As they continued to dig through the chest, they found more disturbing details. Several of the journals contained sketches, drawings of symbols of people standing in strange ritualistic poses, and of figures that seemed to be trapped in the pages themselves. There were even sketches of children, their faces twisted in fear, their eyes wide with terror. In one of the more chilling drawings, the children were depicted in what appeared to be a dark ceremony, their hands raised as if summoning something. The authorities couldn't make sense of it at first, but the images were enough to send a shiver down their spines. It was clear that the orphanage had not just been a place of care for children, it had become the site of something much darker. The journals, filled with references to the occult and forbidden practices, hinted at the presence of something powerful and malevolent that had taken hold of the orphanage. The deeper the authorities went, the more they found. The symbols on the chest, the drawings in the journals, and the strange rituals described in the pages all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. The orphanage had been involved in something beyond human comprehension. What had once been a refuge for the abandoned had been twisted into something else entirely, a place where dark forces had been allowed to thrive. The investigation was no longer just about uncovering the orphanage's mysterious closure. It had become something far larger, a search for the truth about what had really happened within those walls and what had been allowed to fester there. As the authorities pieced together the fragments of the story, they realized that the orphanage had been a front for something far more dangerous. Those who had come to the orphanage to care for the children had not been ordinary people. They had been involved in practices that went far beyond the bounds of what anyone could comprehend. And the children themselves, those who had lived and grown up in the orphanage, had been unwitting participants in a much larger, more horrifying scheme. As they pieced together the evidence, it became clear that the authorities had only scratched the surface of a much deeper mystery. The journal spoke of a figure, a man, who had been involved in the orphanage's darkest secrets. He was never named, only referred to as the leader or the keeper. He was the one who had orchestrated the rituals, the one who had drawn the children into the web of darkness that had taken over the orphanage. And it was he who had ensured that the secrets of the building remained buried, hidden from the world outside. The journals hinted at his influence, how he had used fear and manipulation to keep the staff and children in line, to keep them silent. It was as if he had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, controlling everything that happened within the orphanage's walls. But the authorities couldn't find him. His name, his identity, was buried in the shadows of the orphanage's past. It was as if he had never existed at all. The only trace of him was in the journals, in the strange symbols, and in the horrifying accounts left behind by those who had worked at the orphanage. But it wasn't just the journals that told the story. The building itself, the very structure, held secrets too. The investigators began to notice things they hadn't before. The layout of the orphanage, the placement of the rooms, the strange architecture. All of it seemed to have been designed with a purpose that no one could fully understand. It was as though the building had been constructed not just to house children, but to hold something within it, to contain a power that could never be released. With each passing day, the authorities uncovered more about the orphanage's twisted history. The journals, the locked rooms, the strange symbols, everything pointed to the same conclusion. The orphanage had been a place of dark rituals, of things that no one should ever have to endure. And as the investigation continued, they realized that the true horror of the orphanage was not in the physical space itself, but in the darkness that had taken root there, a darkness that had been allowed to grow unchecked for far too long. What had started as a refuge for the lost had become a prison for the soul, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been blurred beyond recognition. The final room, the one that had been locked away for so long, had become the epicenter of it all, a place where the last remnants of the orphanage's twisted legacy had been sealed away, waiting for someone to finally uncover the truth. As the investigation deepened, it became increasingly clear that the orphanage was not just a site of tragic neglect. It had been a focal point for something far darker, something insidious. The hidden rooms, the secret journals, the strange symbols, each discovery seemed to peel back another layer of the building's haunting past. The more the authorities uncovered, the more they realized that the orphanage had been at the center of something that stretched far beyond the local community. Whatever had taken place within its walls had reverberated outwards, its impact felt long after the doors had been shut. The children, the staff, and even the very architecture of the orphanage seemed to carry a legacy that no one had fully understood until now. The deeper the investigation went, the more the authorities began to question the true purpose of the orphanage. What had it really been? A place of refuge for abandoned children, or something far more sinister, a place designed for darker purposes? The idea that the orphanage had merely been a shelter for the orphaned was becoming harder to accept, as each discovery painted a picture of a much more complex and disturbing history. The journals, written by the staff members who had been there during its final years, painted a chilling picture of an institution that had shifted from its original mission into something that served an entirely different agenda. What began as a place of safety had morphed into a site of ritual, mystery, and deep psychological trauma. The authorities were now able to piece together a timeline of events that spanned decades. The orphanage had been founded with noble intentions, built to house the town's orphan children and offer them the protection they needed. But over time, the foundation of the building itself seemed to take on a life of its own. The staff, particularly those who had worked there for years, began to behave in ways that could only be described as unsettling. Many of them had come to the orphanage as idealistic young people, eager to help. But as the years passed, they became more withdrawn, more secretive, and more disturbed. Some spoke of hearing strange noises late at night, whispers from the walls, faint voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Others described the feeling of being watched, of an invisible presence that was always lurking, just out of sight. One former staff member, now in her late 80s, was one of the few who had stayed at the orphanage for an extended period of time, working there for almost 30 years. She recalled that, over the years, the orphanage had become less of a sanctuary and more like a prison. The building, she said, had started to feel like it was alive, its halls stretching longer, its rooms feeling colder and more oppressive. The children, too, had changed. They began to exhibit strange behaviors, sometimes acting in ways that seemed beyond their years, as though they knew things that they should not have known. It was as though the orphanage itself was influencing them, feeding them thoughts and fears that were not their own. The caretaker spoke of children becoming fixated on certain parts of the building, particular rooms or hallways, that seemed to hold a strange power over them. She recounted how one child, a young boy named William, had become increasingly withdrawn in the final months of the orphanage's operation. He had begun to draw pictures of strange figures, tall, shadowy shapes that towered over the buildings. The drawings were often accompanied by scrawled words, some in a language the caretaker couldn't understand. The boy spoke of hearing whispers late at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. He would tell the caretaker that he wasn't afraid of the shadows, that the shadows were his friends. The more the staff attempted to care for the children, the more they felt themselves slipping. The building had begun to exert its influence over them, and by the end, many had left, unable to endure the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled in the orphanage. But those who stayed behind had witnessed the full extent of what was happening. They had seen the gradual transformation of the children, from innocent and curious to fearful and withdrawn. Some staff members had tried to rationalize it, blaming the behavior on the trauma the children had experienced before coming to the orphanage. But deep down they knew there was something more at play, something they couldn't explain. As the investigation continued, the authorities were able to piece together more about the children who had lived there, particularly the ones who had vanished without a trace. Over the years there had been several disappearances, children who had simply gone missing, their names erased from the records. The staff had never been able to provide a clear explanation. Some claimed that the children had run away, but the stories never quite added up. Others said that the children had simply wandered off into the nearby woods, but no evidence was ever found to support these claims. The most disturbing part, however, was that many of these children had been in the care of specific staff members who were now dead or untraceable. As the authorities dug deeper into the records, they uncovered evidence of strange events that had been covered up for years. Several children had been found in a state of extreme distress, unable to speak, shaking uncontrollably, and babbling incoherently about things that made no sense. They spoke of strange figures, of dark shapes that moved within the orphanage's walls, and of voices that echoed through the halls at night. Some of the children had even claimed that they had been touched by something that wasn't human. The reports were vague and the children's testimonies were inconsistent, but the authorities couldn't ignore the growing number of accounts that pointed to something beyond the ordinary. One of the most chilling discoveries was the revelation that the orphanage had been connected to a series of strange events that had occurred in the town long before the building was even established. The town had been founded on land that had been rumored to be cursed, a place where ancient rituals had been performed centuries ago. The founding families of the town had been aware of these rumors, but they had chosen to ignore them, believing that the land was safe for settlement. But as the authorities began to piece together the town's history, they realized that there was a dark undercurrent running through the community, one that stretched far beyond the orphanage. The town's earliest records, dating back to the late 1600s, spoke of strange occurrences, disappearances, unexplained deaths, and a pervasive sense of fear that had gripped the area. The local town archives contained accounts of people who had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, their bodies twisted and contorted in ways that defied natural explanation. In some cases, the bodies had been found in the woods surrounding the orphanage, their eyes wide open as if they had died in sheer terror. Local legends spoke of an ancient cult that had once inhabited the area, a group that had engaged in forbidden rituals to summon dark forces from beyond. The cult's members were said to have disappeared without a trace, but their influence was said to linger, seeping into the very soil of the town. The orphanage, it seemed, was built upon this land, and whatever dark force had once thrived here appeared to have found its way into the building's very foundation. The authorities began to wonder, had the orphanage been constructed on a site that had been cursed from the beginning? Had the land itself been a key component in the sinister events that had unfolded within its walls? The more they uncovered, the more the investigation began to feel like an unraveling nightmare. Each discovery only led to more questions. Each step forward seemed to push them deeper into a darkness they weren't prepared for. They had started with the simple task of understanding why the orphanage had been closed, but now they were faced with a horrifying reality. The building had never been just a home for children. It had been a vessel for something far older and darker, something that had been feeding off the very lives of those who entered. And at the heart of it all was the question that no one had yet been able to answer. What had really happened to the children who had lived there, and what had been buried in the orphanage's final room? The authorities were determined to find out, but as they ventured further into the mystery, they couldn't help but wonder if they were already too deep, if the darkness had already claimed them. As the investigation moved forward, the authorities found themselves navigating a series of increasingly inexplicable events. Each discovery seemed to amplify the sense of dread that had already taken root in their minds. The orphanage, once seen as a simple institution for children, was now revealing itself to be the epicenter of something far more sinister, something that had been hidden for decades. Despite their best efforts to piece together the fragments of evidence, the authorities were quickly becoming aware of just how little they truly understood about what had transpired within those walls. The more they learned, the more they realized that the orphanage's secrets were not only buried deep within the building itself but were intricately tied to the very fabric of the town's history. One of the key revelations came when the investigators were able to track down a former resident of the orphanage, a woman named Margaret, who had grown up there during its final years of operation. Margaret had left the town years ago and, like many of the other former residents, had lived in relative silence about her experiences. She had never spoken to anyone about what had really happened in the orphanage, but the authorities were determined to learn more, especially after discovering that Margaret's name had appeared in several of the journals found in the hidden chest. The authorities contacted her, hoping to gain a first-hand account of the orphanage's atmosphere, and to their surprise, Margaret agreed to meet with them. When Margaret arrived for the interview, she was a different woman from the one described in the journals. Older, more composed, but still visibly marked by the trauma of her past. Her eyes, however, told a different story. There was a certain sadness, a heaviness to them, as though she carried the weight of something she had never been able to forget. She had grown up in the orphanage during the last few years of its operation, but even now, decades later, the memories were vivid and disturbing. Her voice, though steady, betrayed her as she recounted what she had witnessed during her time there. Margaret described a building that, even then, felt alive. It wasn't just the strange atmosphere that permeated every corner, it was the very design of the orphanage. The long hallways, the narrow rooms, the strange layout, it was as if the building itself had been constructed with a purpose that none of the children or staff could comprehend. Margaret spoke of feeling as though the orphanage was watching them, its walls closing in around them. The feeling of being trapped, of being unable to escape the oppressive energy of the building, was something that still haunted her. But it wasn't just the building itself that disturbed her, it was the people, the staff, and the strange behaviors they exhibited. The caretakers, whom Margaret had once looked up to, had changed over the years. Some of them had become distant, almost robotic in their actions, while others had begun to act in ways that were entirely out of character. They would often disappear for hours at a time, leaving the children unattended. And when they returned, they seemed to carry an air of secrecy about them, as if they were hiding something. Margaret recalled one particular incident involving one of the senior caretakers, a woman named Evelyn who had worked at the orphanage for decades. Evelyn had always been strict but kind, at least at first. But as time passed, her behavior became increasingly erratic. Margaret remembered a time when Evelyn had taken her and a few other children into a room deep within the orphanage, a room that had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. The room, Evelyn told them, was where important things happened, but she would never elaborate further. Margaret had never forgotten that day. Evelyn had led them into the room, and as the door closed behind them, the air grew colder. The room itself was unlike anything Margaret had seen before. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, and the floor was covered in old, faded markings. It was as if the room had been used for something ritualistic, something that no one should have been allowed to witness. But the most disturbing part was the way Evelyn had acted. Her eyes had seemed vacant, distant, as though she was no longer fully present. She spoke in a voice that wasn't her own, reciting words that Margaret couldn't understand. The children had watched in confusion and fear, not knowing what to make of it, but the sense of dread in the room had been palpable. Margaret's voice trembled as she recalled the events of that day. She remembered the unease that had settled in her chest, the strange feeling that something dark and ancient was lurking just beneath the surface of the orphanage. When Evelyn had finished, she had ushered them out of the room quickly, as if nothing had happened. But Margaret knew something had. The children had been told not to speak of the incident, and in time, they had all learned to suppress their fears and memories. But the feeling of being watched, of being part of something larger than themselves, never truly left them. The most disturbing thing Margaret revealed, however, was the fact that she had witnessed something far more horrifying in the orphanage's final days. As the building began to close its doors, many of the children were sent to new homes, but some were left behind. Margaret had been one of the last to leave, and during the final weeks before the orphanage was shut down, she had witnessed a series of strange events. She spoke of hearing screams in the dead of night, screams that seemed to come from nowhere. The sound would echo through the hallways, reverberating in the walls, and the staff would quickly usher the children back to their rooms, telling them that it was nothing, just the building settling or the wind. But Margaret knew better. She recounted how, in those final weeks, the children who had been left behind began to act strangely. They became withdrawn, almost as if they were no longer the same people. Margaret remembered one particular child, a young girl named Clara, who had always been cheerful and full of life. But near the end, Clara became distant, her eyes wide with terror, as though she had seen something that no one else could. Margaret had asked her what was wrong, but Clara only shook her head, refusing to speak. She would often stare at the walls as if listening to something, her face contorted in fear. It was then that Margaret realized that the orphanage was not just a place of physical confinement, it was a place of mental and emotional torment, a place that twisted the minds of those who stayed within its walls. As Margaret spoke, the authorities began to piece together a horrifying picture of what had taken place in the orphanage. The strange behaviors, the locked rooms, the hidden rituals, everything pointed to the fact that the orphanage had been more than just a refuge for children. It had been a site for something darker, something that had been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. But even as Margaret revealed these details, the authorities knew that they were still only scratching the surface. The full extent of the orphanage's horrors remained locked away, its secrets buried beneath years of silence and secrecy. Margaret's testimony, though invaluable, only deepened the mystery. She spoke of a presence that seemed to inhabit the building, a presence that had a hold on the children, the staff, and even the very structure of the orphanage itself. Whatever had taken place there, it wasn't just the result of a few isolated incidents, it was part of something larger, something that had been set in motion long before the orphanage had ever opened its doors. And as the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the orphanage had been a vessel for something that had been waiting to be uncovered, a truth so dark and powerful that it had been hidden away for generations. The final room, the one that had been locked away for so many years, was the key to unlocking this terrifying mystery. But the closer the authorities got to the truth, the more dangerous the journey became. It was as if the building itself was determined to keep its secrets buried, no matter the cost. And yet, they pressed on, knowing that they had no choice but to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. With Margaret's testimony revealing a glimpse into the orphanage's terrifying past, the authorities felt as though they had crossed a critical threshold in the investigation. But they also knew that the most crucial part of the mystery had yet to be uncovered. The building itself, the structure that had stood as a silent witness to decades of trauma, held the key to everything. The final room, the one that had been sealed off for so many years, was more than just a physical space. It was a symbol, a hidden reservoir of the orphanage's darkest secrets. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that whatever had transpired in that room, whatever had been locked away, had somehow managed to shape the lives of everyone who had come into contact with it. The authorities had already encountered several obstacles in their quest to access the final room. Despite their best efforts, the room remained a mystery, its location only vaguely referenced in old, incomplete building plans. It was as if the room had been deliberately erased from the records, its existence ignored or even suppressed by the institution's administration. But the investigators were not deterred. With every new piece of information, their resolve only hardened. They began to examine the blueprints of the building once again, studying them in detail, searching for any hint of the hidden space that had been locked away for so long. But the plans were more than just incomplete, they seemed deliberately misleading. As though someone had intentionally altered the designs to obscure the truth. Every hallway, every doorway seemed to lead to dead ends, every turn seemed to take them further away from their goal. But they were determined. They knew that the truth was within reach and they couldn't stop now. The breakthrough came when they discovered a journal entry buried deep within the town's archives. The entry, written by an architect who had worked on the orphanage's original construction, provided an unexpected clue. The architect, whose name had been largely forgotten by history, wrote about a special room, an unusual design feature that had been added at the last minute. According to the entry, the room had been intended as a place of refuge for the children, a room that would be isolated from the rest of the orphanage to allow for a more focused environment. But the architect, in a rare moment of candor, had written something else that chilled the authorities. The room had been designed to keep certain things contained. What those things were, the architect never elaborated on. The entry was vague, but it was clear that whatever had been meant for containment was something the architect himself found troubling. The final room was not just a place for children, it was a place for something darker. As they dug deeper into the town's history, the authorities found more disturbing evidence. The orphanage, they learned, had not been built by well-meaning philanthropists. It had been constructed by a group of powerful individuals, local elites, many of whom had ties to the town's oldest families. These families had been involved in something far more sinister, something that predated the orphanage by generations. There were whispers of occult practices, of hidden ceremonies and forbidden rituals. But what struck the investigators most was the realization that the orphanage had not been an isolated institution. It had been part of a much larger network, one that spanned decades if not centuries. This network of influence had kept the truth hidden, burying it beneath layers of secrecy and deceit. And the final room, with its locked door and sealed windows, was the very heart of this dark history. The authorities knew that they had to get inside.